The phone rang at midnight, shattering the silence of Edward's apartment. His hand trembled as he lifted the receiver. A faint static filled the line, then a broken whisper emerged. "They know where you are." Before he could respond, the voice cracked into silence. Suddenly, a piercing scream echoed through the night air outside. Edward rushed to the window, but the empty street stretched below him like a lifeless stage. His heart pounded, his breath sharp, and he whispered to himself, "What the hell is happening?" He ran downstairs, drawn by instinct, only to find a small object lying in the middle of the road. It gleamed under the flickering street lamp, its surface scratched with strange symbols. The night was heavy, the air chilled, and every shadow seemed to watch. Edward crouched, staring at the object, hesitant to touch it, while the whisper from the call lingered in his ears like a curse. The scream, the silence, and the object all stitched together a dark beginning that felt impossible to escape. Edward carried the object upstairs, his fingers numb as though it burned despite being cold. He set it on his desk under the lamp, its markings more menacing in the light. He whispered, "What are you?" His words vanished into silence. The symbols seemed almost alive, twisting when his eyes shifted. Edward pulled out an old notebook, scribbling shapes, but none matched. His unease grew as the apartment's air thickened, pressing down on him like unseen hands. Suddenly, a knock echoed at his door. He froze, heart pounding, waiting for another. But the sound never came again. Only silence, heavier and louder, surrounding him. He whispered again, "Someone left this for me." His reflection in the dark window seemed to nod back at him, as if mocking his fear. The object lay on the desk, patient and waiting, as though it had always belonged there. Edward couldn't sleep. He lay awake on the couch, staring at the ceiling, the object glowing faintly from across the room. Memories clawed at him. The night years ago when he failed to stop someone he loved from vanishing into shadows. The guilt never left him, buried deep, but tonight it clawed back. He whispered, "I can't do this again." He sat upright, sweat cold on his skin, his heart echoing in the silence. The air hummed with something alive, something unseen. Every tick of the clock felt louder, every creak in the walls sharper. His mind raced, torn between throwing the object away or unlocking its secret. He closed his eyes for a moment, but the whisper from the phone replayed, cruel and taunting. "They know where you are." He covered his ears, but the words still echoed inside him, gnawing at his fragile calm. The next evening, Edward ventured outside, hoping the night air would clear his head. The streets were quiet, rain dripping from gutters, neon signs flickering weakly. He lit a cigarette, his hand trembling as he inhaled. That was when he felt it. The prickling on his neck, the sensation of being watched. He turned slowly, scanning the dim corners of the street. A shadow shifted across the alley, disappearing as if swallowed by the darkness. "Who's there?" Edward called out, his voice breaking slightly. The silence that answered was cruel, thicker than before. He quickened his pace back home, his pulse hammering. With each step, the sound of his shoes echoed too loudly, as though someone followed. He dared not look back, the thought alone heavier than the rain. When he reached his door, he fumbled with the keys, desperate to lock himself inside. Edward sat in silence, the object before him once more. His nerves were shredded, but curiosity outweighed fear. He muttered, "If someone left this for me, they want me to find something." He carefully traced the strange carvings with his finger, feeling their sharp grooves. The air thickened again, shadows stretching longer on the walls. He grabbed a magnifying glass, studying the marks, and suddenly realized they formed a sequence. His breath caught, and he whispered, "Coordinates." The realization hit him like thunder. But fear gripped harder. Whoever sent this letter knew his name, his past, and now where to find him. The walls of the apartment seemed to close in. He stood abruptly, knocking over a chair. His reflection in the window stared back, distorted by the rain, reminding him that answers came with a price he wasn't sure he could pay. Edward sat at his desk, staring at the coordinates scrawled in his notebook. The memory of loss gnawed at him, pulling him back to nights when silence was heavier than any scream. He whispered, "Why me? Why now?" His voice cracked with exhaustion. The letters' markings pulsed in his mind, symbols twisting like shadows in the corners of the room. He reached for a faded photograph of a woman smiling at a summer fair, her presence a ghost that still haunted him. He whispered her name, but stopped before the sound left his lips. The room felt colder. The past weighed too heavy, refusing to release him. He pressed his forehead against the desk, muttering, "I can't fail again." The whisper from the phone returned, coiling through his memory. "They know where you are." The words fused past and present into one suffocating truth. The following day, Edward stepped outside, restless and searching for clarity. The streets were gray, the air heavy with drizzle, neon signs bleeding faint color into puddles. That was when he noticed a figure across the street, leaning on a lamppost. The stranger wore a long coat and a tilted hat, face half hidden. Edward froze. The figure raised a hand in acknowledgement, a slow, deliberate gesture that carried weight. "Do you know me?" Edward muttered under his breath. The stranger gave no answer, just a small nod before turning and vanishing down the alley. Edward's pulse spiked as he whispered, "Wait." He hurried across, but the alley was empty. Only the sound of dripping water remained, echoing like a warning. Whoever that stranger was, they wanted him to know they were watching. Back in his apartment, Edward spread out notes, scribbled sketches of the symbols littering the desk. The object sat in the center like a predator waiting to strike. He leaned forward, eyes bloodshot, and muttered, "This isn't random." As he connected the shapes into patterns, he noticed something new. The markings were aligning into a map. His hands shook as he traced the lines. Suddenly, the lights flickered, plunging the room into shadows before flaring back. The air turned suffocating, thick with dread. "You're trying to lead me," Edward whispered, feeling watched though he was alone. The sense of being guided into something inevitable filled him with both fear and obsession. He slammed his pen down, whispering, "What are you pulling me toward?" The silence gave no answer, only deepening the mystery. Later that night, Edward knocked on the door of an old friend, Daniel, who once promised loyalty but carried secrets of his own. Daniel opened the door hesitantly, his eyes narrowing at Edward's tense face. "I need your help," Edward said, voice low. Daniel shifted uncomfortably, his hand tightening on the doorframe. "I don't get involved anymore," he replied, his tone sharp but laced with fear. Edward stepped forward, his desperation spilling out. "You know something about this, don't you?" Daniel looked away, the silence louder than denial. Finally, he muttered, "Some things are better left buried." Edward's jaw clenched, frustration warring with fear. The air between them grew heavier, an unspoken truth lingering like poison. That same night, Edward returned home, exhausted, but the object still sat waiting on his desk. He stared at it, whispering, "This is all connected." The silence pressed harder, suffocating. A gust of wind rattled the window, though it was shut. Then faintly, a new sound filled the room. A knock, soft but deliberate, echoing from nowhere. Edward spun, eyes darting across the shadows. No one was there. He clutched the desk, whispering, "Stop it." But the knock came again, closer this time, though the door remained untouched. His breath came fast, his pulse loud in his ears. Every corner of the room seemed to close in, as though someone unseen stood just beyond reach. He whispered, "I'm not alone," though he wished desperately to be wrong. Edward followed the coordinates to a derelict warehouse at the river. The air carried a metallic chill that scraped his throat. He pushed the door, and the hinges screamed like a warning. A single light buzzed overhead, carving out a circle of grim clarity. At the center lay a figure, still and wrong, with a red smear near a fallen envelope. Edward said, "Please be alive," though he already felt the truth. He knelt, hands hovering, afraid to touch the past now made flesh. The envelope bore the same symbols, etched like wounds across cheap paper. He whispered, This was sent to me, and hate for the sender burned hot. Sirens wailed far off, thin and indifferent, as if the city had already moved on without them. Edward searched the office upstairs and found a corkboard covered in maps. Strings crossed neighborhoods like veins feeding a hidden heart. He traced the lines and found dates that matched the nights he woke from old nightmares. He said, "This began years before I knew." A ledger sat open, each page marked with a red symbol beside a name. Some names were crossed out with violent strokes. He felt watched, though the room held only dust and a stale draft. He whispered, "How many letters were sent?" The question hollowed the space, making his voice sound smaller than he felt. He pocketed a torn corner that showed today's date circled twice, as if time itself were complicit. On his way out, Edward spotted Lauren at the gate, confused and holding a parcel. She said, "This was left for you at the lobby." Her smile faltered when she caught his expression. He took the box and felt a ticking dread beneath the cardboard. He said, "You should leave now." A car idled across the street with its lights off, a patient predator in plain sight. Lauren glanced at it and her breath shortened. The parcel clicked, soft and regular, like a metronome for fear. Edward hissed, "Go to the corner store and stay inside." She nodded and hurried off as the car's engine growled. The sound slithered after her, dragging the night into chase. Edward called Daniel and demanded answers. Daniel arrived, tight-lipped, eyes tracking every shadow. Edward said, "Someone mapped my life like a crime scene." Daniel stared at the parcel and exhaled in surrender. He said, "I was told to keep you away from the board." The words cracked open, a door Edward feared existed. He stepped closer and asked, "Who told you?" Daniel looked down, shame knotting his jaw. He said, "If I speak the name, we both lose time we don't have." Silence flexed like a fist between them, heavy and final. Edward felt the thin ice of trust spider across and threatened to break. The parcel's ticking grew louder, counting down a fate not yet chosen. Edward set it on the ground and eased the lid open. Only a red letter rested inside, folded with cruel care. He said, "It wants me to run." A hiss sliced the air, and a flare ignited on the roofline. The alley erupted in white glare as a figure moved above like a phantom. Daniel shouted, "Down!" Edward dropped behind a dumpster. A shrapnel pinged along the brick. The flare burned out and darkness crashed back with a roar. Footsteps sprinted across the roof, then leapt away. Edward rose slow and said, "They wanted the message seen, not the bomb." The ticking had stopped. The silence was now the threat. Edward stormed into Daniel's apartment, rage cutting through his restraint. He slammed the red letter onto the table and shouted, "You knew more than you told me." Daniel's face hardened, guilt flickering before he masked it with defiance. He said, "I did what I had to." Edward leaned forward, voice breaking, "You kept me in the dark while others died." Daniel looked away, shame settling in the silence. "If I told you," he whispered, "they would have come for both of us sooner." Edward felt betrayal sting sharper than fear. The air in the room thickened, walls closing around truths that had been buried for too long. The red letter pulsed between them like a living wound. Edward clenched his fists, knowing trust was gone. Edward left Daniel behind and found himself in an alley where the stranger from earlier reappeared. The long coat, the tilted hat, the unreadable gaze, this time closer. The stranger said, "You've already chosen the path, whether you believe it or not." Edward stepped forward, anger boiling. "Who are you?" The man only smiled faintly, his eyes unreadable. "Think of me as a warning," he murmured. Edward's pulse hammered as he asked, "Are you the one sending these?" The stranger tilted his head. "I'm only the one who knows how it ends." Before Edward could grab him, he melted into the shadows, vanishing without a trace. The alley felt colder, emptier, and yet the warning still echoed like thunder in Edward's bones. Edward sought answers and turned to Margaret, the eccentric archivist who worked in the city's forgotten library wing. She flipped dusty tomes, muttering, These symbols are older than you think. Edward leaned over the table, desperation raw in his voice. Tell me what they mean. Margaret, half smiling, replied, They are coordinates not just of place but of memory. Someone is binding your past to your present. Edward's skin prickled as he realized every letter was a step backward, as much as forward. Margaret's eyes gleamed with unsettling excitement. This is not just about death. It is about design. Edward shivered, the echo of her words unraveling him. He whispered, Then I'm already caught in it. That night, Edward returned home and for the first time felt a brief calm. He placed the letter in a drawer, locking it away. For a fleeting moment, he thought silence had returned. But then the walls shifted with a groan, as though breathing. Shadows lengthened unnaturally across the floor. He whispered, Not again. The lights dimmed, then flared violently. His reflection in the window was not his own. The eyes staring back were darker, colder. Edward staggered, knocking over a chair, fear hollowing his chest. The calm was an illusion, a cruel trick. The house itself seemed to mock him, showing him that safety no longer existed. Later, Edward sat alone in a diner, neon buzzing above, rain streaking the glass. He thought solitude might steady him, but even here he felt eyes watching. A waitress placed coffee before him and whispered, They told me to give you this. She slid a folded note across the counter. His stomach dropped as he unfolded it. The same symbols marked the page, but beneath them were 4 words, You cannot escape this. Edward's hand shook as he crumpled the note. He muttered, They're everywhere. The waitress avoided his gaze and hurried away. He sipped the bitter coffee, staring out at the dark street, and wondered if there was any place left untouched by the shadow of the red letter. Edward arrived at the precinct to speak with Detective Harris, a man known for bending rules. Harris leaned back in his chair, cigarette glowing faintly in the haze. Edward placed the letter on the desk and said, This has already killed someone. Harris smirked bitterly, muttering, Letters don't kill, people do. Edward leaned forward, desperation etched across his face. Then find the people before they find me. Harris exhaled smoke, eyes narrowing. You think you're the first to bring me one of these? The words froze Edward's blood. He whispered, There are more. Harris said nothing, his silence heavier than denial. Edward realized the man was hiding something vital. Trust shattered again, leaving him stranded with only questions that grew sharper in the smoke-filled air. Edward stumbled out of the precinct, rain washing down his face as neon lights flickered over the wet streets. His paranoia clawed deeper, every passerby's glance burning like suspicion. He muttered, They're all watching. The city seemed alive, hostile, swallowing him whole. His reflection in the shop window distorted, twisting into something unfamiliar, mocking his fear. He punched the glass with his fist before realizing what he'd done. Pain split through his knuckles, blood mixing with rain. His breath came ragged, chest tight, and he whispered, I'm losing myself. The sound of footsteps followed him, echoing in sync with his own, too close to dismiss. He turned sharply, but the sidewalk stretched empty, cruelly silent. The spiral had begun, and there was no way out. Back in his apartment, Edward sat with Daniel and Lauren, tension knotting the room. Daniel muttered, We should burn it, end it here. Lauren shook her head, fear clouding her eyes. No, destroying it makes it worse. You don't understand. Edward's voice cracked as he said, We're turning on each other, and that's exactly what they want. The object pulsed faintly on the desk, like a beating heart. Daniel slammed his fist down, shouting, It's cursed. Lauren recoiled, tears filling her eyes. Edward pressed his palms against the desk, trying to hold the fragile alliance together. If we don't stand together, we're already finished, he whispered. But in the heavy silence, trust fractured further, each of them splintering under the weight of fear. Later that night, Edward walked alone down a deserted rail yard, hoping to clear his head. The silence was absolute, until a sudden crash split the air. He froze, his breath visible in the cold. Between the train cars, a shadow lunged. He stumbled back as a blade slashed the air where he had stood. His heart thundered, lungs burning as he ran, weaving between rusted steel giants. The attacker's footsteps followed, relentless, scraping steel as they closed in. Edward whispered breathlessly, "Not like this." He dove behind a container, clutching his chest, blood trickling from a shallow cut on his arm. The footsteps stopped, replaced by silence so sharp it cut deeper than any blade. He dared not move, every second stretching into eternity. Edward returned home shaken, his mind rattled by the chase. He collapsed into his chair, eyes heavy but refusing sleep. The object glowed brighter than ever, filling the room with red light that bled into every shadow. He whispered, "It knows me." Suddenly, the glow intensified, casting visions across the walls. Burning cities, screams of unseen faces, and himself standing alone at the center. He grabbed his head, crying out, "Stop!" But the images pressed harder, a storm of terror breaking his sanity. When the glow finally dimmed, the apartment was silent again. Edward sat trembling, staring at the object with hollow eyes. He whispered, "If this is a vision, it's a promise." The silence, after, felt like the beginning of something much worse. Edward confronted Daniel in the warehouse once more, his voice shaking with rage. "You lied to me from the beginning," he spat. Daniel's face twisted, torn between fear and regret. "I never wanted this, Edward," he said, but the words rang hollow. Edward slammed the latest red letter on the table. "You were part of them all along," he hissed. Daniel's silence confirmed the betrayal. The weight of every unanswered question crushed Edward's chest. His friend, his last fragment of trust, had become another ghost in the labyrinth. The shadows of the warehouse seemed to lean closer, as though feeding on Edward's despair. Daniel whispered, "I tried to protect you." Edward's voice broke. "Then why does it feel like you've already buried me?" The trap was sprung before Edward could leave. The sound of chains echoed as the heavy door slammed shut behind him. A hidden voice called from above, cruel and taunting. "You were always meant to be here." A figure stepped from the shadows, the stranger in the coat. Edward's blood chilled as the man removed his hat, revealing the face of Harris. "Surprised?" he asked, his grin sharp with triumph. Edward staggered back, whispering, It was you all along." Harris's eyes gleamed, venom dripping from his voice. "Every letter, every scream, you walked right into it." Edward's heart hammered, realization crashing down that every path led to this betrayal. The warehouse felt like a coffin, and Harris held the nails. Harris advanced, voice dripping with contempt. "You think you're special, Edward, but you're just another name on the list." Edward clenched his fists, anger surging. "You killed them," he shouted. Harris only laughed, the sound echoing like iron scraping bone. He raised a knife that glinted under the flickering light. "This was always meant for you." Edward darted sideways, toppling a crate, his breath ragged as he whispered, "Not tonight." The chase began, Harris stalking him between shadows, blade flashing like a serpent's tongue. Edward's fear warred with fury, each step a desperate gamble. The warehouse became a maze of steel and darkness, every corner a trap waiting to snap shut around him. Edward stumbled into a corner where the metallic object lay, placed like bait. Its glow filled the space, red and pulsing, whispering in his mind. Harris closed in, voice sharp as a blade. "It's not the letter that kills, it's what you do with it." Edward grabbed the object, its heat searing into his palm. His voice cracked. "If this ends tonight, it ends with me." The glow flared violently, bathing the warehouse in crimson. Harris faltered, shielding his eyes, growling, "You don't even know what it is." Edward stepped forward, his fear consumed by fury. The red glow burned brighter, shadows melting into the walls. He whispered, "Then I'll make it yours." The warehouse erupted in chaos as the object pulsed like a heartbeat, shaking the ground. Edward screamed, hurling the glowing letter at Harris. The red light exploded, sending Harris crashing into steel beams. He groaned, broken but alive, his laughter still echoing. "You think this is the end?" Edward staggered, his vision blurred by the light's aftermath. He whispered, "It has to be." Smoke filled the air, alarms wailing in the distance. Edward collapsed to his knees, chest heaving, as the glow faded to nothing. Harris's shadow vanished into the smoke, leaving only silence behind. Edward clutched the floor, broken but unyielding. The climax had left scars that would not heal. The warehouse lay in ruin, smoke curling through broken beams. Edward staggered outside, his chest aching with every breath. The night air felt no freer than the prison he escaped. He muttered, "It isn't over," his voice hoarse. Sirens wailed in the distance, but no help would come for what haunted him. Every shadow whispered the same truth. The red letters were not finished. He clutched his coat tight, blood still wet on his sleeve, and forced himself to walk. Each step felt heavier, as if the ground itself carried the weight of betrayal. Behind him, the warehouse flickered with dying light, a monument to secrets buried and revealed. Edward whispered, "The real war has only begun." Edward wandered through empty streets, neon signs flickering like dying stars above him. He sank onto a bench, exhausted, eyes hollow. He whispered, "I don't know who I am anymore." Paper fluttered across the ground, landing at his feet. He bent down and froze. Another red letter, its edges burned yet intact. His hands trembled as he picked it up. The words inside were fewer this time, but they struck like a blade. "You survived. But you belong to us now." His breath caught, and he whispered, "They'll never stop." The silence of the street closed around him, turning his isolation into a prison without walls. In the days that followed, Edward avoided sleep, haunted by visions of burning cities and faceless whispers. He taped black cloth over windows, locking himself in shadows. One night, as rain pounded, he caught movement outside. A figure stood across the street under a flickering lamp, unmoving. Edward whispered, "Who are you?" But no answer came. The figure lingered, silent, its face hidden by shadow. His chest tightened as he realized it was not Harris, nor Daniel, nor anyone he knew. This was someone new, watching and waiting. Edward pressed his hand to the glass, breath fogging it, heart racing. The figure slowly lifted a hand, as if promising more to come. Edward gathered the fragments of the letters on his desk, arranging them like a puzzle. His hands shook as the markings aligned into something far more terrifying, a larger design carved through time. "This was never random," he whispered, voice breaking. The patterns mapped a network across the city, each letter a piece of a grander plan. His mind reeled with the realization that every tragedy had been orchestrated, his life a pawn in a scheme much bigger than himself. He pushed back from the desk, eyes wide with horror. "They've already written the ending," he whispered. The shadows seemed to laugh, mocking his futile discovery. The final night came quietly. Edward sat alone, staring at the last letter, now slid under his door. His hands shook as he unfolded it. The message was chillingly simple. "Look behind you." His breath hitched, heart stopping. He turned slowly, every nerve screaming. The room was empty, but the window was open, rain sweeping in. On the desk sat another object, identical to the first, glowing with faint red light. Edward whispered, "It's starting again." His voice cracked as the shadows deepened, swallowing the room. The silence was absolute until a faint whisper echoed, "You cannot escape the past." His eyes widened, fear and resignation intertwining as the screen of his world faded to black.